Preparing in fianchetto allows bishops to exert influence over long diagonals, but also subtly cedes central pawn control early on. Immediately contesting the center grants black excellent counterplay and opens lines for their pieces. Developing the knight here prepares for kingside castling and pressures black's central pawn advance. Solidifying central pawn presence, black prepares to contest the king's bishop's diagonal. Developing the bishop here prepares for a kingside fianchetto, reinforcing control over the long diagonal. Developing the bishop to eye the center often forces the opponent to defend their knight, potentially compromising their pawn structure. Developing this pawn subtly reinforces the center and prepares for further queenside expansion. Developing the knight to d7 bolsters the d5 pawn and prepares for potential e5, reinforcing the central pawn chain for future skirmishes. Challenging the bishop's placement, this advance creates a subtle yet decisive pawn structure shift, potentially liberating the kingside. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn and open queen diagonal dramatically alters pawn structure and king safety for white. Opening the bishop's diagonal enhances piece activity and prepares for central pawn advances. Establishing central presence, this pawn push aims to challenge white's control and open lines for active piece play. Developing the knight to a central outpost aims to support a pawn push and control key squares. Developing this knight shores up the center and prepares for kingside castling, a sensible step towards king safety. Initiating central pawn action to contest space and potentially unbalance the position. Shedding central pawn tension opens diagonals, but risks white's knight's influence on the kingside. Reclaiming central space with this pawn capture opens a diagonal for your bishop and aims to pressure black's undeveloped queenside. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing white's center. Securing the monarch is paramount, and this castling maneuver brings the king to safety while activating a crucial rook. The queen now eyes the central pawn tension and prepares for potential queenside development. Solidifying central control and preparing for potential queenside expansion creates a robust pawn structure. Securing the monarch initiates a strategic retreat, preparing for central pawn pushes. Expanding on the queenside offers immediate territorial gains, though it leaves the king's pawn structure a tad exposed. Securing the bishop on this advanced outpost challenges white's queenside expansion and aims to disrupt the pawn chain. Launching a flank offensive to gain queenside space and potentially create a passed pawn. Rethinking pawn structure and opening lines for the rook seems wise given white's queenside expansion. Unifying queenside pressure, this maneuver prepares to contest the open d-file and bolster kingside safety by clearing the queen's escape route. Focusing the rook onto the open c-file is a good step to contest central influence and potentially disrupt white's queenside expansion. Developing the bishop here prepares to contest the crucial central files, subtly challenging black's pawn structure. Shattering the pawn center initiates a dynamic struggle for initiative and open lines. Prying open the queenside flank aggressively expands white's sphere of influence and cramps black's pieces. Unleashing the knight's potential, e8 aims to reroute towards the kingside or bolster the center's pawn structure. Asserting central control, the knight eyes the isolated pawn and prepares a swift invasion. Instilling a more dynamic central presence, this knight relocation aims to challenge white's queenside expansion and prepare for an aggressive central pawn push, potentially opening lines towards the king. Asserting pressure on the d6 knight, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's central pawn structure and exploit the slightly exposed king. Solidifying the e-pawn's defense, this move subtly aims to restrict white's bishop scope. Sharpening the attack on the kingside, the bishop eyes potential breakthroughs and disrupts black's pawn structure. Sacrificing a pawn, black seeks to open lines and activate their pieces against white's somewhat exposed king. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure advantage opens the diagonal for your queen and rook. Shifting the king away from the newly opened diagonals, protects it from potential discovered attacks. Opening the queenside flank aggressively, white aims to disrupt black's piece coordination and create space for bishop activity. Consolidating the bishop onto a more active diagonal prepares for potential challenges along the central files. Opening the central file with the rook offers infiltration possibilities and reinforces control over d1. Nodding to the forgotten rook, the knight seeks a better outpost, aiming to disrupt white's central control. Targeting the queen's current diagonal, the queen shifts to pressure the kingside pawn structure. Trading the rook opens the d-file and frees the knight, aiming to exploit black's potentially exposed king. Reclaiming the open file solidifies control and prepares for potential breakthroughs against black's somewhat passive setup. Reclaiming the open file is essential, as black fortifies their position while white's rook stands isolated. Disrupting black's rook battery, opening the file for potential king pressure, and simplifying towards an advantageous endgame. Consolidating pieces around the now open d-file creates a strategic dominance that black must neutralize efficiently. This pawn push creates immediate queenside pressure, aiming to restrict black's bishop and potentially open lines for a kingside attack. Solidifying the pawn chain to prevent further queenside breakthroughs. Prioritizing king's safety now is a wise strategic adjustment, as the queens are off the board. The queen repositions, eyeing the d-file and preparing for potential piece exchanges, a subtle shift in the positional balance. Repositioning the queen aims to prepare for potential exchanges and support a central pawn advance later. The knight now aims to occupy the central outpost on f4, disrupting white's pawn structure and potentially creating attacking chances. A subtle repositioning, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Repositioning the knight to e7 aims to challenge the knight on c4, disrupting white's control and opening avenues for counterplay. Sharpening the assault, that queen eyes the vulnerable f7 square, creating a potent threat of discovered attacks. Securing the king's shelter becomes paramount after such pawn pushes. Sacrificing the queen here seems to usher in a king hunt, exploiting the exposed monarch. Seeking to shield the monarch from the pawn storm building on the kingside, this defensive repositioning attempts to consolidate the king's safety. Repositioning the bishop here aims to pressure the pawn on g6, potentially forcing further concessions or opening lines towards the black king. Shifting the queen to a more active central square, aiming to coordinate with the remaining pieces and potentially exploit white's somewhat passive setup. Bolstering the king's defenses, this pawn push anticipates potential breakthroughs and solidifies the monarch's sanctuary. Opening the queenside with a bold counterthrust, aiming to disrupt white's well-entrenched pawn chain. A surprising retreat, offering a tempting pawn sacrifice to potentially activate a sidelined queen. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize central initiative, aiming to disrupt white's harmony and create dynamic imbalances. The pawn advances, seeking to shatter black's surprisingly solid pawn wall, hoping to open lines for the queen. Reigniting the central fight, the knight's leap aims to disrupt white's king safety and create counterplay. Unleashing a decisive checkmate threat, this unexpected discovered attack forces black's king into a precarious, exposed position. The king scurries to a slightly safer square, but the attacking avalanche continues.